Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast. My guest today is the defense and security analyst and Gulf expert, Andreas Krieg. Andreas, good to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
I want to start, first of all, just with a quick question about Trump's latest tactic after threatening to destroy Iranian civilization if they did not open up the Strait of Hormuz. Now he's blocking the Strait of Hormuz. What do you make of that?
I'm no longer shocked, to be honest. If you think what has been happening for the last 6 weeks, the announcements, the walkbacks, the doubling down, he kind of contradicts himself 3, 4 times a day. And then at the same time, the idea of thinking about blockading Iran to stop their blockade ultimately leads to a prolonged blockade of the Straits of Hormuz, which seems to be the ultimate goal right now, is really, opening up the Straits of Hormuz. So it seems counterintuitive in many ways, and then it begs the question to what extent that can actually succeed. And first of all, succeeding in getting the Iranians to make the concessions at the negotiation table, highly questionable, and then obviously it's self-defeating if it comes to opening up the Straits of Hormuz. So I think he's run out of options. He's with the back against the wall. That's probably a desperate act of last resort at a time when he understands that he doesn't have anything in his toolbox anymore. There are no military levers that he can pull. He's certainly been advised, I would suggest, by his military that there isn't a good military option, that escalation is not possible. Landing troops on the islands or on the shores of Iran would be major escalation, and frankly, there's not enough bandwidth and capacity in the region right now to do it. So that's probably the last best option, as it were, when really he doesn't have any options. And I think for the Iranians, it all comes back to the same point. It's an asymmetric standoff where the Iranians have a much lower, much higher threshold of pain vis-a-vis the US, where the Americans need to, especially Trump in particular, has to compete with an enemy who will ultimately sustain a much more pressure for much longer. So it's not really a good tactic, and it's certainly nothing that will, I think, change or sway the negotiations in terms of where they're going, because very difficult to enforce. And I think the first test of a blockade, because at the moment, I think this blockade exists mostly on paper and on social media. The first test will really be when a Chinese tanker coming from an Iranian port trying to go through the blockade, and then it will be down to the U.S. Navy to make a decision of whether they will fire, whether they will board the vessel, and what kind of options do they really have if the Chinese vessel just continues straight, as the Chinese have suggested. They're being very defined, and they're saying we're doing what we need to do. This is part of our sovereign interest. And also the Chinese, if there's one thing the Chinese can't compromise on, it's their flow of resources, oil, energy into their country. They're not going to compromise on this. So what will the US do really? And is that might be a completely new level of escalation that we're seeing. So I think if I was Iran right now, I'd probably sit this one out and see where things are going.
Okay. Now, I want to then ask you about the extent to which the security of the Gulf states has been compromised by this war with Iran. Of course, the Gulf states were not consulted before it was launched. They are really on the front lines. How damaging has this been to their security?
Fundamentally, I think this will change everything. This is a traumatic experience for every single Gulf state. Maybe less so for the Omanis, but for all the 5 Gulf states, this is a traumatic experience. Traumatic in multiple ways, not just because they're on the receiving end of an unprecedented, prolonged attack from the air, ballistic missiles and drones, but also the fact that they feel that they've done so much for the United States in terms of putting money into the US economy, trying to sway the Trump administration, individuals in the Trump administration, Trump himself. They put on a massive show a year ago when Trump was coming to the Gulf. And they thought they had him, and that he's a transactional guy that you can rely upon. And it turns out it's the exact opposite. He's unreliable. He doesn't keep his side of the bargain. And for the most part, there is a sentiment that is really trickling down now, setting in, is the feeling of abandonment by the United States and not having any good alternative options. It's not like saying, okay, we're pulling out because we can't trust the US anymore. ultimately there is an alternative. Equally, the Gulf states have been abandoned by the Chinese, have been abandoned by the Russians, far worse by the Russians because, as it turns out, the Russians have been sharing intelligence with Iran to attack the Gulf states. Similar allegations have been made against the Chinese, who see the Iranians as a sort of bulwark against this in this multipolar order, vis-a-vis the United States and the Gulf states as an extension of that. So I think there are so many different levels of escalation, all of them coming together in the Gulf. The Gulf, in many ways, has become anyway a front line in this sort of east-west and north-south divide that we see globally. And so all of these kind of fault lines coming together and all of that being escalated right now, exactly right there at this spot in the Gulf states are playing balls in many ways of great power interest, and they now have to reckon with the reality of a failed security framework or failing security framework that was too US centric, and then having to see what they can do to get away from it, because disentanglement as it stands right now from the US is not possible in the short term. The entire systems, command and control structures, intelligence sharing and whatnot is built around the US. So I see the Gulf states will double down on this, while at the same time trying to, and they have no other choice, to diversify away. And we're seeing that with Ukraine, we're seeing that reaching out to the European countries, and potentially reaching out to China and Russia as well, to become more autonomous, more sovereign when it comes to defending themselves.
Yeah, that's the direction they need to go in. And as you say, that sense of abandonment that they are feeling, very much the case. But I look at the situation and think that it's the GCC. They need a unified approach for security. Do you see that happening? Because, these guys cannot get along on a whole range of things.
No, you're right, and that remains a big problem. There aren't any. I can't. They probably agree on one thing right now: is that the status quo is unsustainable. The Straits of Hormuz can't remain closed, and while they're divesting away and trying to find alternative modes of transport away from the Strait of Hormuz, none of this will help them in the short term. I think we will see in mid to long term more pipelines being built and more alternative routes being created that will bypass the Strait of Hormuz. But for the time being, they don't have any option. And so, against this backdrop, the only thing they really agree on is let's open up the Strait of Hormuz for now. How we do it, means and ways to be used to do it, that's where they really fundamentally disagree. I think we have a spectrum where the Omanis are on one end of the spectrum saying only engagement with Iran, the future is with Iran, being very belligerent and, almost anti-American in their messaging. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got the Emiratis, who are at least vocally, verbally on social media and also in terms of what they're writing, from a comms perspective, are saying we're doubling down on Israel and the United States because there's no alternative. But then if you look at action activity, Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed, Mohammed bin Zayed's son, has traveled to China a couple of days ago. Another very important signal of saying, the UAE will not just side with the United States and just blindly follow, which is kind of part of the policy that they've pursued for a long period of time. And then you have different countries in between. The Saudis are, very, very, feel alienated by the activities and actions by the Iranians. They certainly going back to where they were before, seeing Iran as the major threat in the region. But at the same time, I was saying we don't have any good military options. So what we need to do right now is kind of finding a diplomatic off ramp and helping the Pakistanis to build this, and helping the Americans, keeping the Americans engaged in a diplomatic off ramp. Qatar is always, mediator, trying to pursue a diplomatic approach, helping in the background with the Trump administration, keeping them on site as well, engaging with JD Vance. So I think the Qataris also, very much in the middle of it. They're not where the Omanis are, because also the Qataris have suffered severe damage. They're extremely disappointed. And also everyone you speak to in Qatar says quite clearly things have to fundamentally change in bilateral relations between Qatar and Iran. It will not go back to ex-ante relations as things were before the 28th of February. But then again, the Qataris are saying we live, we're prisoners of that geography, so we have to maintain that relationship. The Kuwaitis on the other end of the spectrum, or in the middle of the spectrum, at the other end geographically of the Gulf, have alternatives in terms of supply chains. They could potentially run via Iraq and Syria, trying to build supply chains towards the Mediterranean. Not in the short term, obviously, but they have to. They also see themselves as being victimized by the Iranians. And so there is a sentiment of Iran is a threat, but how can we deal with it? Is it through military confrontation? Is it through engagement? I think there is. I think more countries are pivoting towards a Saudi position, classifying the Iranians as a threat, but keeping channels open and building a pan Gulf sort of security framework. I would say, though, that the Emiratis are not part of it, and I'm not sure that the Omanis are part of it. But certainly Qatar and Saudi, I think, are the sort of backbone in this. And there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of coordination between Riyadh and Doha over how to manage security moving forward. But, we've talked about it on a previous podcast. The rift between Saudi and the UAE is still there, and it's not going anywhere. And I think we're seeing some of it already coming out in the open over Pakistan, where the Emiratis are really breaking with Pakistan, being heavily disappointed by not being included in these negotiations, pulling out money and swaps from the central bank, and then the Saudis and the Qataris are doubling down, saying we'll have your back, Pakistan, we'll help you in this. So it seems like, again, the Emiratis are the odd ones out in the Gulf. The Omanis are slightly the odd ones out because they're too neutral, have too much of a friendly relationship with the Iranians. But ultimately, I think if it comes to the remaining four states, Bahrain, Saudi, Qatar, and Kuwait, they're probably going to build a framework that is more Saudi-centric.
Okay. So the Saudis well, as you say, the competition between the UAE and the Saudis accentuated by this situation. The last time we had you on the podcast, Andreas, you spoke about Netanyahu's strategy. We talked about Trump having no strategy whatsoever, but his strategy, and you call that a strategy of chaos. I look at what he's doing right now in Lebanon, the ongoing settler terrorism in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, the continuing genocide in Gaza, the Iran war, and I wonder, how is Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy of chaos looking to you?
I think he's the most predictable of all these players right now. From a golf perspective, you've got three madmen or three mad countries. You've got the Iranians, you've got the Israelis, and you've got the US. All of them are fairly unpredictable, certainly unhinged in many ways. But I think the most predictable of the three is probably Netanyahu, because he's been very much pursuing the same strategy, the same narrative for 3 decades. And it's one of force-centric, it's a force-centric approach. It's military force and power over anything else. He has never really considered any real off-ramps. He's a man who is really interested in, if at best, at tactical sort of diplomatic solutions, but not strategic ones. The mowing the lawn strategy, which is about spreading chaos and keeping every country around Israel in a permanent state of limbo, where you can dictate the terms and where you can interfere and escalate as it wants to. We've seen that in Lebanon, obviously happening in Lebanon right now, but they'll probably try to do the same in Iran. Any sort of agreement with Iran should have a back door where Israel can strike as they please, when they please, without being stopped by the Americans or anyone else. So for Netanyahu, trying to keep his keeping himself out of court and out of the trial, he needs a conflict to continue, and he's got multiple fronts to play with. And as he does, he is quite happy with a chaotic situation that keeps the Israelis in a permanent war. And I think there is now a realization, finally, in Israel as well, that this madness that we've seen triggering this genocidal war in Gaza, that this madness is now spreading to Lebanon, has been spreading to Syria, spreading to Iran, potentially to Yemen and Iraq, that there aren't any red lines anymore for Israel to continue permanent war. And there's also been a realization among more and more Israelis that Netanyahu isn't actually a very good leader in wartime, because he doesn't end conflicts, he just stops them, he pauses them, but he's not able to actually achieve strategic outcomes. and settlements. Permanent conflict is hitting, is having taking a big toll on Israel's economy, on Israeli society, on polarization, on emigration and immigration. So Israel can't sustain this, and the IDF has said it time and again. They can't sustain these multi-front wars for an indefinite period of time. And I think Netanyahu has really reached the end of that, and so he has to engineer a crisis again to say, listen, I wanted to get out, but for this reason, there's another actor that is trying to eradicate us from the map, so we need to go and fight. Very much in many ways, this is a continuation of the chaos strategy.
Yeah, and a strategy that, as you've suggested previously, is leading only one way, which is the ultimately the defeat of Israel, I suppose, down the road. And I'm thinking about too the ceasefires. Every time Netanyahu agrees to a ceasefire, he almost immediately violates it before the ink's even been dried. It's just another tactic he uses. You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and the security and defense analyst Andreas Krieg. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Sign up and you will receive the first 2 months for free. That's arabdigest.org. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz as a powerful economic weapon. What a kind of hard power the Iranians are using, and one that's impacting the entire world. And it's up against, or was up against until the ceasefire began, this massive firepower of the U.S. and Israel. So are we beginning to see the limits of kinetic warfare? Can overwhelming military might be neutralized?
Yes, it can, but this is not a new thing. Small actors have won wars against much bigger actors throughout history. There've always been means of asymmetric warfare, whether kinetic warfare or non-kinetic warfare, that were able to win the day. And more than winning the day, they usually win the war despite losing the battle. And so this is the same thing all over again. The idea of, as Kissinger was saying, it's these kind of non-state actors in Vietnam, or these weaker actors, all they need to do is survive to win. As long as they're not losing, they're winning. And for the US, they have to win in order not to lose. That is still true when it comes to Iran. For me, the IRGC is a militia that operates like a militia, but it has a state and a massive economy behind it. But they operate like a militia. And hence they have this massive, very, very high threshold of pain, and are set up to sustain pressure indefinitely. And in many ways, the using the Straits of Hormuz, this deterrent that has always been in the room, we knew about it, but them activating it now, they're basically showing to the world that it is working, and there is very little that the international community can do without completely destroying the world economy. And so in many ways, I think the strategic lever that the Iranians were accused of pursuing, which is building a nuclear weapon as an ultimate deterrent, might no longer be necessary if you have the Straits of Hormuz, if you're able to hold the world economy for ransom. And if the Iranians don't want to change their posture, if they decide they keep the status quo with the Straits of Hormuz, there is very little we can do as the international community, that the US can do, to bomb the Iranians into submission and make them change their will. And that's the problem. That's what we're seeing right now. And it's an asymmetric tactic. It's one that ultimately will wreck the Iranian economy as well. I mean, it's not like they're completely beyond any pain, but it's not the pain necessarily that the IRGC will be the pain that the Iranian people and the Iranian economy will feel. And so they're set up to sustain this for an indefinite period of time. And hence why I said early on that Trump has run out of good options to change the sort of balance of deterrence. He dug himself a very deep hole. He's very deeply into this quagmire. And if he really, really wants out, he will have to compromise. And I hope that the Iranians, because that's the other problem, is that the Iranians are willing to compromise, because they're obviously now a regime that is highly decentralized, with internal friction between hardliners and even harder hardliners. And some of them don't want to talk at all. They're saying we're powerful enough to sustain this indefinitely, and we really want to punish the Americans. This would be really, really bad. And hence why I think this blockade comes at a very, very problematic time and runs the risk of escalating beyond a point of return.
Yeah, you wonder where this will go. As you said right at the top, Trump's unpredictability, his volatility. the fact that he is really running out of options, a desperate man in a desperate place, and also we could wonder about his mental competency at this stage. But one one of the madmen that is causing a great deal of anxiety and uncertainty. Um, in your book, Subversion, the strategic weaponization of narratives, you wrote about Hasbara, the Israeli propaganda machine, which has been very effective, it seems to me, in neutering response from Western governments, including the UK, in the atrocities that have been committed in the Gaza, Lebanon, and the occupied territories. But is it running out of road with the debacle of the Iran war, or is Hasbara really still a powerful, powerful weapon for the Israelis?
Hasbara itself is more of the PR. It's the PR, the communications element of it, which cannot be seen in complete isolation from what the Israel lobby is doing in the UK and the US, which is not necessarily attached to Hasbara. They're using Hasbara narratives to advance their agenda. But I think it's a coercive, compulsive framework that keeps on, forcing and compelling policymakers and people in academia and in media to either look the other way or adopt a pro-Israeli outlook. That sort of pressure in the United States is waning. Or I should say, the pressure is actually, they're doubling down on the pressure, but the effect that the pressure is having, that effect is waning. That's certainly something we can observe. We certainly see this on the far right within the America First MAGA camp, where people have now solidly turned against Israel, who now call out Israel as the main instigator of this war, a failed war. And it's probably, I would say, the worst American strategic disaster since Vietnam. Some people say it's even worse than Vietnam in many ways because it's come with so much warning. There were so many better alternatives out there. It came in complete isolation from a grand strategic vision because, after all, Vietnam fit the overall grand strategic vision of the time. But this war doesn't fit the grand strategic vision. It doesn't fit the presidential ideological vision. It doesn't fit the MAGA vision. It doesn't fit any military vision. So it is a very, very, it's probably one of the worst strategic disasters in US history. And it's been coming not because of internal fighting in the U.S. administration, but because of pressure from Netanyahu and the Israel lobby, in particular on Trump and the people around Trump, and that is something that Americans will not forget. And we're seeing a major pivot away also from young liberals, but also young Jews. We've seen some of even more pro-Israeli outlets and pro-Israeli pundits turning on Israel in this one, saying this was a strategic disaster. They don't necessarily turn on Israel or full out, but they're certainly turning on Netanyahu, which is already showing where the wind is blowing. In many ways, people are so fed up with Netanyahu, and Israelis are fed up with Netanyahu. And I think Hasbara now finds it very, very difficult. Also because Hasbara is no longer hasn't for the last 3 years hasn't been a neutral pro-Israeli talking point machine. It's been a machine that's been pro-Netanyahu. So the more you associate yourself with Netanyahu, the more vulnerable you become. And we will see now in the midterm elections affiliation with AIPAC being not a badge of honor, but it's actually it's going to be the cause for you to potentially lose your seat. So you want to dissociate yourself from AIPAC and the Israel lobby. That is a completely new trend, and we still have obviously a lot of the older generation people who are traditionally ideologically more pro-Israel still in power, but they won't be in power in 5 to 10 years' time, at which point the people who have now seen and witnessed what's been going on in Gaza and in Lebanon and in Iran, and these people will turn on Israel, and they have already turned on Israel, and they will be the ones determining who will be in power. So I think across the West, certainly in the United States, but also in the UK, it's become people have finally come out calling out Israel over Lebanon, calling out Israel over Iran, calling out their war crimes, because what we call the Overton window, the window of what you're allowed to say, what you can get away with saying, has opened so much that things that we were unable to say over Gaza, despite the fact that it was truthful, facts based. These things now we can say about Israel because of what Israel has done, because you can no longer deny what Israel is doing. And so that it will change fundamentally. And I think that's the greatest strategic defeat for Israel. The problem for Israel isn't necessarily that they're unable to translate tactical developments and tactical objectives into strategic ones in Iran, because there's certainly Iran is also a disaster for Israel. The biggest strategic disaster is, though, that Israel has lost all its networks, all its alliances, all its support. The only people who still support Israel are people who are being coerced or compelled into following Israel. And that's a very, very bad situation, because if you cannot build consensus anymore, you've basically effectively lost civil society, and you've lost those people who vote in liberal elections in democracies in the West. And that is the most strategic defeat of Netanyahu.
That's the loss of goodwill and really the whole idea that the victimization of the Jews in the Second World War and beyond that was a very powerful um, card to play, if I can put it that way, that goodwill is evaporating. But do you
Mm.
think here in the UK we're seeing that, Andreas, this government which was so supportive of Israel in the Gaza conflict, is that happening here too, that this government is beginning to turn away?
Look, they're not becoming critical of Israel, but they have said things that are far more critical now than things that we've seen 2.5 years ago. What we see is silence on a lot of issues, which isn't great. This is not where we want to be. And there is a massive disconnect between what the people in the UK see and feel and think, and what policymakers feel say and how they act. There is a massive disconnect. But I think it's now so overwhelming that there isn't a single, pundit, analyst, if you look at intelligence people, people in the military, people who traditionally have sided with the IDF and Israel, who've, been very understanding of the Israeli campaign in Gaza, are now saying this has gone too far. What they're doing in Lebanon is going too far. What they've done in Iran has gone too far, because ultimately it's not about values, it's about interests. And I think a lot of people who are in charge of managing, designing, orchestrating strategy and policy to defend national interests for the UK are now realizing that what Israel is doing in the region is fundamentally undermining UK national interests, certainly with the Straits of Hormuz, but certainly also Israeli attacks on civilian infrastructure in Iran and petrochemical infrastructure, as well as energy infrastructure. All of that will have ramifications for energy prices here in the UK. And if the one consensual thing in the UK is prosperity and the decline of prosperity, then Israel is now a major, a force multiplier of that. They are helping Britain becoming less and less prosperous. And so a lot of people have to call them out, because it's about interest. It's not no longer about values. It's not that it makes any difference, because Netanyahu couldn't care less what British people have to say. And, they've been the ones, if you look at their minister of Chigley, who's the Hasbara affairs, I think. The way that he's been framing Britain and the British people, I mean, it's been very, very belligerent, attacking the UK. And so it becomes very difficult now, even for the Reform Party, to stand by Trump, stand by Israel, and support this war. They initially tried to do it and then realized they had to kind of take a step back, because this was something that's going to hurt them at the ballot box.
Yeah. Just finally, I wanted to reflect a little bit, Andreas, on JD Vance's not very good week. He went off to Islamabad, charged by Trump to get a ceasefire deal moved forward. He had dropped in on Orban on the way over to support Orban, the Hungarian leader, and of course, his party was hammered. Orban lost very, very heavily. And then Trump, with this bizarre image that he put out of himself as Jesus Christ healing the sick, Vance having converted to Catholicism, having to find a way to support his boss, but also not to offend the Pope. God, of course, being the person who decides who's the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. So JD Vance in a bit of a pickle this week. But um, do you see Vance in any way being able to navigate the United States towards a sensible withdrawal to give Trump some kind of an off ramp that he's not completely humiliated? Is Vance the one that could pull it out of the fire, so to speak?
Well, it's early days. I mean, nobody should have come to Islamabad thinking that within 24 hours you will settle a 50-year-old conflict. That's not was never going to happen. I see this as a tactic more than anything, withdrawing, flying out and saying, okay, that's it, we're not having a breakthrough. It's quite clear that there will be another round because war is not an alternative. There is no plan B. There's no real military options for either side, I think. So I'm not too I'm still hopeful and somewhat optimistic that there will be another round. For many years, I used to watch South Park in the 90s, and I feel in many ways what the US has become is a worse version of South Park in many ways. You know, the Trump fighting the Pope, Trump posting himself as Jesus. It's mad. And certainly he's unhinged. I think he's becoming what he always accused Biden to be. I mean, senile. He doesn't know necessarily what he's doing, what he's seeing. He can't tell between truth and fiction. But JD Vance, in all of this, among the blind people, the one-eyed is a king. And JD Vance is someone who is still ideologically connected to the MAGA base. He's the only one within the cabinet who strongly opposed the war. He has not commented on the war for quite a long period of time, which had to do with the fact that he didn't support it, still doesn't support it. He's the one speaking to the Omanis and the Qataris directly and saying, look, I don't want this war to continue. We obviously can't pull out losing this war, but we're willing to make some concessions and some compromise. He is, though, the one who wants no enrichment. So on the nuclear file, he's really, creating and putting down really red lines. But on other issues, he seems to be able to compromise. If you compare him to Kushner and Witkoff, who are essentially just, they take their initiative and they take their orders from Donald Trump, J.D. Vance has a slight, teeny tiny bit of agency. And so hence why I think he can detach himself. Also because politically speaking, unlike Kushner and Witkoff, who will return to their real estate businesses after this, J.D. Vance is a politician and he wants to potentially stay in power and wants to become president. And that's his moment to do that. It's his moment to take a stance, to prepare the ground for the midterm elections, but also for 2028, and say, listen, this war will define the future of Trumpism. It will define the future of MAGA, the future of the GOP. And here's a man who can say, look, domestically speaking, I was always against it. On the record, there's nothing that suggests he was for it. While if you look at Rubio and you look at others, they're certainly being entangled in this war. So there is a big point to be made here that J.D. Vance can use this as a massive opportunity for him politically, and why I hope, and that's also why the Gulf states, particularly Oman and Qatar, are focusing on him, and why the Pakistanis are focusing on him. He is probably the best bet that the international community has among the blind people in Washington to help get us to a deal. It's not going to be easy, but it's certainly better than Witkoff, Kushner, and Trump himself.
Okay, we'll leave it there, Andreas. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was the defense and security analyst, Andreas Krieg. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. Our support comes only from our subscribers. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. We're following the Iran war and other developments in the Arab world with analysis and commentary from a team of Middle East experts you will not find anywhere else. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest, essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.